Well, hello, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to chair this session. What we had in mind is an opening session just to explain what the Open University Gender Critical Research Network is. To that extent, I have invited Dr. John Pike from the Department of Philosophy at the Open University. Welcome, John. I've also invited Dr. Laura McGrath from the Department of Psychology at the Open University.
Hi.
And Professor Rosa Freedman, who is a professor at the University of Reading. I was waiting for Rosa to go hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so as everyone will be able to recognize, what we're hoping for is an informal conversation. Hopefully we won't all talk over each other, but if we do, those of you who are listening to us, please just bear with us. This is a live recording, and I think that we need to add to that adage, never work with children and animals, never work with academics on a live recording. So if there's some stumbles, please bear with us. Right, well, John, Laura, myself, and a few others are the founding members of this research network. It's hosted by the Health and Wellbeing Strategic Research area at the Open University. One of the reasons that we are hosted by that strategic research area is because we see some inherent connections between the overall research aims of the Health and Wellbeing SRA and the sort of work that a gender critical research network could provide. Because in essence, what we're looking at is human well-being. Now, as we have on the webpage, we are a group of scholars who are interested in trying to understand how and in what ways sex bodies matter in different sorts of contexts. And I've asked these three wonderful people to join me just to really highlight what it is that we're hoping to get out of the network, what it is that we hope we can contribute to, both our disciplines, but also more broadly academia and the research environment here. There are three questions that I'm going to put to each of the panelists. I'll probably chip in because I like to talk and I like to hear my own voice. Hopefully this will be about a 30-minute long video cast, podcast. I don't know what you call these things. I grew up in the 20th century, so some of this technology is brand new to me. So without further ado, I'm going to start with John, then go to Laura, then to Rosa, and ask, what does the term gender critical mean to you? So John, could you help us understand a little bit, please?
Yes, I'll say what it means to me, and this is up for contestation, of course. So there's a very boring sense that I'll start with, in which gender criticality or being gender critical just means being critical of gender stereotypes. And this is a sense in which it's kind of widespread in social theory and social policy and on the political left, if you like, and that's where I come from, and so I'm critical of gender stereotypes. So there you go. But virtually everyone would say would buy into that, the idea that there are certain ways in which you have to behave to properly be a man and properly be a woman. So that's general, and I think I've got nothing hugely interesting to say about that. There is a big issue in, if you like, the philosophy and metaphysics of gender, what gender identity is, and whether there is this kind of the nature of the identity posit, what the idea that there is some kind of essential identity that we have, sometimes that we're born with, sometimes the claim that you just know it intimately and immediately, and that causes problems for people like me who just say, I don't have this sense of gender identity. I know I'm male, but what is there beyond that? And then there are issues. So my big kind of research area is sport, and gender critical views in sport seem to me to be roughly right, and say, look, it's sexed bodies that matter for sport and not how one identifies. And then pursuing that line into kind of contemporary debates about categorization in sport is just a facet and an outcome of taking a gender critical view and just seeing sex and gender as both important categories, but emphasizing sex and sexed bodies as kind of important and significant in certain aspects of the social world.
Thank you. That's really good. Laura.
Yeah, so yeah, I think I agree that there's these two elements to gender critical thinking, and one is about sex and one is about what gender is and what it means. And certainly the idea that sex matters, especially for women, that sex is immutable and that we shouldn't and can't get rid of it as a category without, causing quite a lot of harm. For me, that's a really central claim in gender critical thinking. And the second one is, as you said, John, that gender stereotypes are harmful. But I think further than that as well is, for some people in particular, that comes from a radical feminist analysis that gender roles are oppressive to women, as well as being limiting and harmful for both sexes. And that's really, I think that radical feminist analysis of gender that sees gender as this hierarchical system of expectations, roles, symbols that exists particularly to perpetuate patriarchy, so the domination of women by men. I think that analysis has been really important in the development of gender critical ideas and activism, but it's also not held by everybody who would count themselves as gender critical by any means at all. So I would see that radical feminist analysis as being really central, but also not everything that we're talking about here. I think one of the things that I think would be really interesting to look at, because I don't know how much this has really been thought through or discussed, is where those kind of lines are and what are the kind of positions on gender and gender identity, and is that radical feminist analysis of gender even really anything to do with gender identity? Like, for me, they're such different concepts, we maybe need different words for them. I think in a way they need to be completely disassociated. So I think that diversity is going to be really interesting to explore here. I suppose in terms of my research, as a psychologist, I'm interested in experiences of health and mental health in particular. And I feel it's really crucial to be able to research women's lives and experiences as distinct from men's lives and experiences. And those are not the same thing. And especially when we're talking about health, women's bodies are different, our health needs are different, and that is an extremely under-researched area already. We already have a male default in health research and practice. So for me, I feel like this will give a really good platform to just be able to have that as a position that it's okay to be explicit about, and for that to be explicitly explored, because there's so much research that still needs to be done on women's health that it's absolutely under researched already. We don't need further barriers to that, I think.
Brilliant. Rosa.
So it's an interesting question that if you'd have asked me 3 years ago, am I gender critical or what does it mean? I might have sort of looked at you like you had 3 heads growing out of one another. I'm an international human rights lawyer, and I think about human rights as fundamental to every person by virtue of being born human. And within international human rights law, which started in 1948 in sort of the aftermath of Nazi Germany and what the Nazis did to their own citizens at that time, there was this movement towards we all have fundamental rights by virtue of being born human, and we should see one another as the same because we're all human beings. I mean, very quickly it became apparent that, of course, there's intersectionality of our oppression. right? People might have additional abuses of their human rights because of disabilities or their sex or their race or any other things that are protected characteristics. Now, in law, it's pretty simple, and this was reaffirmed by the Employment Appeal Tribunal last week. It's pretty simple that sex is about biology. There was a case about it. I won't go into it in great detail, but I can, if you want me to later. That when we're thinking about sex in law, we're thinking about biology and specifically about chromosomes, gonads, and genitals. In law, women have been oppressed on the basis of their sex. They continue to be on the basis of their sex in pretty much every society throughout history in the world. Women are seen as vessels to carry men's children. Women are seen as property of men, whether they're fathers, whether they're then sold to their husbands for a dowry, things like this. Women are oppressed on the basis of their sex, but they're also oppressed on the basis of gendered constructs, the social constructs of gender, right? So you've got a finite amount of food, so you might provide it to your male child, not your female child, or you've got a finite amount of money, so you'll educate your male child, not your female child, and so on. So the concepts of sex and gender, I've long understood in law and in practice. But this idea of being gender critical, I think, well, I can thank my mother for this. I was raised gender critical. I was raised by a radical feminist, right? In the 1980s, when I was a small girl child, we all wore the same brown dungarees and played with the same toys, right? So lots of the gendered constructs that we're seeing back now and that I see in my child's life in society are sort of jumping back, a generation or two before me. But this concept of gender critical seems to have grown out of this discussion, well, certainly for me, around reforming the law on the Gender Recognition Act. That's where I first started speaking about this. I've spoken about minority rights, published on minority rights, LGBT rights, women's rights throughout my career. And I think that this concept of gender critical is trying to bring together, as Laura was saying, radical feminists or people with radical feminist perspectives, like I hold, with people that might be critical of these issues, but not from a radical feminist perspective, but from other perspectives. And sometimes the term gender critical can be used in a very derogatory way. I don't know personally individuals who are gender critical, who hold particularly right-wing views, but I do know of them. I know of people that say they are gender critical, but also then seek to limit my access to abortions or any other woman's access to abortions, or to seek to limit maternity rights, right to women to return to the workplace, or seek to limit women's rights generally. And so sometimes the term gender critical can be used in this derogatory way. I think within the UK, how we conceive of gender critical is very much around these discussions of we need to find ways to balance the rights between women as a sex class and between trans individuals, and in terms of also being a group of extremely vulnerable minority, like all minorities, right? And we're all fighting against the same patriarchal structures. But in other jurisdictions, and I'm particularly thinking about some North American contexts, but also some Latin American contexts, the term gender critical ties in with ideological positions with which I vehemently disagree and have spent my career and my life fighting against. So I've not really given you an answer. I've done a Maggie Thatcher here. I've danced around the question and answered something I wanted to. I should put my hands up now and say that no one I know of in my family voted for Maggie Thatcher, but she was my local MP when I was a child, and she did this same thing with questions. She answered what she wanted to answer and never really got to the point that the interviewer wanted to get to. So apologies for that, Jeff.
No, absolutely brilliant. So I'm gonna abuse my position as chair and answer questions as and when I feel like it, and perhaps even reinterpret my own questions as well. To hear that you were in dungarees, brown dungarees in the 1980s makes me feel old, because in the 1980s I was, fully paid up member of the campaign against pornography. I was, at Greenham, I was doing all of those sorts of things. Now, I have really struggled. I'm going to hold up my hand. I'm a founder member of a research network whose name I really struggle with because I'm not entirely sure what it means. And for that, I mean, academically, what it means. We know, how this term has come into politics and activism, but academically, I really struggle with the term. And I'm just going to backtrack a little bit, back to the 1980s, back to the socialists and radical feminists that, you were both mentioning, Laura and Rosa. And it's this: in the world I grew up in, and maybe I'm just like hideously 20th century, in the world I grew up in, my feminism did a both and. It both recognized oppressive structures that were grafted onto sexed bodies, but it denied that those were the necessary outcomes in any social system. So we fought for, we talked about, we researched how it was that, a particular type of body came to produce a particular type of outcome. Now, and by that, what I mean is in things like the justice realm. My entree into all of this, I did research on prostitution. And so, I was deeply sensitized to what justice can mean in, in a modern society where male sexual violence was endemic, and where women's access to criminal justice was singularly unequal to men's access to criminal justice. So for me, the idea of gender criticality now, and this is going to sound a bit bizarre, I wonder if that's actually become one of those empty signifiers into which we can just dump all sorts of hopes and ambitions and research interests. So for me, this gender critical movement, and I came to it much the same way as Rosa did, that was through some of the stuff around the reform to the Gender Recognition Act, or the consultation around that. And for me, one of the really big things that's happened is it's reawakened my imagination and my passion and my drive to really think through, well, hang on a second. We pretend that we have this equality, particularly in modern Western societies, and that we have, a just society, even though we recognize, the oppression of minorities. But actually, we've long since forgotten, or at least not explored what that means in a 21st century context. So for me, I wanted to set this network up really as a place where we can hold open a space to talk about this stuff. Now, I am going to talk a little bit about the one thing that unites Rosa and I, and that's the Rheindorf review of what happened to us at Essex. And I'm only going to talk about that in passing. And it's to say as much as this. Because of the nature of the political activism outside our research areas, it's very difficult to find a space where we can talk about this stuff. Now, the Forstater case that Rosa mentioned earlier is, just a fantastic result, enabling us to actually prize open a space, admittedly virtual, but prize open a space where we can actually do the hard, boring graft of rigorous academic thinking, and to do it without fear. So that's my little summation. Please, Rosa, please.
So I was going to jump in and say, I think it's really important that we have a space that isn't termed radical feminist or any particular one type of theory in terms of researchers, or because what we know is that conversations, discussions, debates, dialogues are how we take forward research in any areas. And terming this gender critical, even if we're not fully sure what that means in terms of ourselves or research, allows a space where we can bring in different people with different views. We don't have to agree with one another. In fact, it's more fun when we don't agree with one another. I think it's really important that we have a man sitting with us today who is expressing gender critical ideas and who has undertaken significant research in this area. I wouldn't be comfortable with a man describing themselves as radical feminist, a radical feminist ally, perhaps. That's only me and my comfort levels, not anyone else's. What we've seen, what we saw from the Rheindorf review, what we've all seen in different ways within academia, is that closing down of spaces or labeling them in too niche a way stops us from talking across disciplines, but also talking across ideas. So something that's very exciting to me about this new network that you're setting up at the OU, and why I'm delighted to even be sort of remotely affiliated with it, is that space for these discussions. We don't always have to have the answers before we start the conversations.
Indeed, before we move on to the next question, I just want to say one other thing that is a deeply held personal belief of mine. I hope that this network isn't just people preaching to the converted, to use a really naff phrase. What I'm really hoping is that we will draw people in who maybe actually don't even know, but who are curious as to what this is, and who are academically and intellectually curious about this.
One of the things that I found, so I'm not going to monopolize the entire conversation, but one of the things that I've found, and I won't name anyone publicly because it would undermine everything about it, is over the last few years, I've continued to have conversations with colleagues that I know and I work with. I mean, many have shied away or have talked to me only privately, but there have been colleagues, including individuals in policy making, in practice in NGOs and in academia, who not only continue to work with me, but actually actively seek me out to have these conversations. Now, the reason that we don't discuss it publicly is because they would come under such sustained attack for talking to me. And yet the message I get from them, and in many ways, I'm very fortunate. I work in an international arena, and I'm known within that international arena for, amongst other things, fighting for LGBT rights around the world in 77 countries that criminalize, torture, and oppress individuals on the basis of their sexual orientation or their gender identity and presentation. So I'm fortunate that people know my credentials, but if this space could become a space where people who are curious or who disagree with us individually or separately, and when I say us, I'm lumping myself into the OU, even though I'm not employed by the OU, I think that's really important. Closing down this idea of no debate is really important. We are here as academics, our central purpose is to address key societal challenges and to discuss and to debate. And if you don't agree with me, feel free, please, to challenge me. You might be right. And if you're right, I'll back down. But if you don't challenge me and only defame me on social media or try and get me fired, then maybe it's because you don't really have a robust argument to make.
Or actually haven't taken the time to figure out what people are saying. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to the second question, because we've kind of veered into it, to be perfectly frank. I'm going to flip the order a little bit here. I'm going to go to Laura first. Laura, why are you interested in being a part of this network? What do you hope to get out of it, both individually, academically, why?
Yeah, I mean, I think very much in what you've both just been saying, what I really am looking forward to is a space to be able to discuss these issues in an academic, deliberative, kind of open way, which isn't so defined by hostility and fear, which has been stifling this for a long time, I think, but certainly the past 5 years very intensely. In terms of my own particular research, I've got kind of two parts of it, which I'm really hoping to bring to the group. So first of all, I'm doing a couple of papers looking specifically at gender medicine. So the one is a paper working with detransitioners, thoughts about what kind of support they would have liked before their initial transition. And through doing that piece of work, I got really interested in the kind of origins of gender medicine and gender identity theory. And I've sort of followed my curiosity there. And so I'm also working on a more kind of historical, theoretical kind of paper, looking at the ideas of John Money and where this idea of gender came from in the first place, and then tracking where it's gone. That would be like a massive book, but this is just a short version of that, but it's mainly focused on John Money's ideas. And I didn't realize previously that, John Money was a psychologist, so he's in my particular discipline, and it was that clinical context that gender emerged in before it got taken up by feminists and queer theorists and trans people and the entire world seemingly. So so that's something that, and both of those papers I've kind of felt that I've had to keep under the radar very much so. So usually I'm quite open, and I really value collaboration and discussion, and I think that everything is stronger if you put it out to people and get their criticisms and get their ideas, and you don't just sit with stuff yourself and sit with ideas yourself. So I really value the idea that this is a space that would be where I wouldn't have to worry about bringing those kind of papers to, or those kind of ideas to in any way. And secondly, as I sort of mentioned a bit before, I'm really interested in women's health, and I think that's partly come from the fact that because of what's been happening in the world, I've read a large amount of feminism in the last 5 years, which I previously had neglected after my, very similarly to Rosa, 80s feminist childhood of mismatched Lego and gender neutral clothes. So I think, so that's kind of, it's sort of ignited really this interest in women's health. And I particularly want to look at women's experiences of chronic health conditions, which are more diagnosed in women and are, surprise, surprise, under-researched. And again, that's not specifically about, you know, the current political arguments that are happening or the debates, but doing a piece of research like that does require you to think that sex is important, is a category, and that we can draw a line between male and female experience. So again, that is something that now I would feel needs to be defended in a lot of academic spaces. And obviously I would always justify my choices in academic research, and I think you have to be able to justify everything that you do. But yeah, I think that those kind of, what used to be quite banal kind of choices have become very politicized. So that's also what I would yeah, that's also what I would hope to bring, really, and be able to have a space to think through those ideas in more detail.
John, and then Rosa.
Yes, I mean, someone mentioned earlier the way in which particular types of bodies lead to particular outcomes. I mean, I'm multiply advantaged in this kind of discussion, partly as someone with a permanent post, partly as a bloke, and partly because so I don't get the same levels of abuse online and so on, and partly because I think sport is the clearest and cleanest bit of the debate. I'm pretty much, you know, of course I reflect on the positions I take, but I'm pretty much convinced that women's sport is a good and liberatory and emancipatory thing, and that it rests on the biological category of sex. You know, so that's not, of course I reflect on that, but it's not really up for grabs. I'm not too uncertain of my position there. And then you can kind of run with that and think about the other social institutions in which a similar sort of line is important, and where sex matters and where it doesn't matter so much, and those features of our social world that are best regulated on a sexed basis. Now, one of the reasons for wanting to be, I mean, I'm involved in the network, is that I'm intellectually curious and curious with this sort of project beyond my own, beyond particularly the ethics of sport, where it's not, the positions that I've taken are not hugely controversial, whereas they are in philosophy as a whole, and they are in the wider arts and humanities. So I'm intellectually curious about how that pans out, and what that tells us about the social world. Another thing that I think is quite worth saying here, and it touches on questions of academic freedom. I've found myself drawn into a certain amount of policy debate in sports regulatory bodies such as World Rugby. Now, I think that process was pretty good. But I think the policy debate and the policy process in a number of organizations has just been really poor quality. It's just been empirically uninformed, conceptually confused, has listened to one voice rather than a multitude of voices, and has ended up with bad regulation, bad policy, and bad law. Now, I'm interested in that phenomenon, and part of it comes from what I think is a chilling atmosphere in academic life. So part of the point of a network like this is to say, you know, there are a series of different and plural perspectives in these areas that are perfectly respectable, perfectly decent, perfectly academically cogent, and they cross from discipline to discipline, and they ought to inform policy, and policy should just be better in these areas through, you know, some careful thinking and some rigorous thinking that is then applied and listened to.
It was always going to happen. I was always going to forget to unmute myself. Rosa, do you want to add to that, or I'm just mindful of time?
I'll add to it very briefly. I just want to acknowledge that there are many universities that close down, even people coming onto campus, teaching about things not related to this, or giving a talk on things not related to this, because they're fearful. So I want to acknowledge that the Open University is doing something really significant, both around academic freedom and around collaborating across disciplines. And I've always collaborated across disciplines. Most of my writing is collaborative, and most of my writing does see me writing with people from outside of law. You know, outside of law is its own place, right? Far away. I'm really fortunate to work at a university that has protected academic freedom from day one on this topic, that has hosted events, but also ensured that peaceful protests, which are a legitimate part of every democracy and a human right, are allowed to occur. And actually, a fair few times the protesters come in and have a cup of coffee with us after the events, and we talk, and the talking is the important bit. So I'm really excited to be affiliated to this network, but I also just want to say to whomever at the Open University is facilitating this, that it doesn't go unnoticed which universities need to publicly apologize and write, actually get independent reviews of their breaches of the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act, and which universities do say that robust academic debate is at the heart of academic freedom and the mandates of public universities.
I'm going to sound like I'm wearing OU colors, and I do suspect that actually if you cut me in half, it would say OU in the middle. I have a deep connection to this as an institution, particularly the idea that we are open to people and ideas. And so if there was ever going to be an institution that should be really backing this, it would always be the Open University. So that's I'm not going to say what my interest in this network is. My interest in this network is making sure that it's here. It's really simple, and anything that I can do to facilitate that, I will.
May I make one small point? There's an issue, I think, within universities, particularly in the UK, which is that people don't like to discuss or to debate. I know many academics who voted for Brexit. I know many of those academics will never say publicly that they voted for Brexit. Many had good reasons. The ones I know from international relations and international development, it was all about sort of political vibrancy. I know many academics who vote Tory. Many of them will not say publicly that they do. I'm not outing any of you, don't worry, I'm not saying your names. There seems to be an issue within universities where, as a child of the 80s, universities were the places to discuss and debate, right? And yet now the universities are places to shut down. And so if my key interest in this network is about discussion and debate, that holds true for anyone that wants to come in and debate with you three members of the network who founded it, or anyone else. And I hope people will feel that they will be respected and that their voices will be heard, and that robust evidence-based debate does not make anyone unsafe.
Exactly. And, you know, well done. that. Great. So just adding a last little question. We've got maybe about a total of 5, 6, 7 minutes. What do you hope, or how do you feel that the network is best enabled by this, talking across all these different disciplines? This is, so far as I can make out, one of the most multidisciplinary conglomerations of people I've ever run across. I mean, I'm used to working with lawyers, never psychologists, because there's like huge paradigm differences between sociology, my home discipline, and psychology. You know, we don't talk to each other very much. And philosophy, I've never really met a philosopher. So just, you know, we'll go John, Rosa, then Laura.
Well, I mean, there are different ways of doing philosophy, but the way I try and do it is the sort of, broadly speaking, analytic way, where what is it? You clarify a few concepts and you make a few distinctions. Shucks, it's a job. That's the kind of account. So clarifying concepts and making distinctions, right? And I think there's quite a lot of that needs to be done here. But that on its own gets you really nowhere in terms of social theory, social philosophy, institutions, policy, anything like that. So this is a different slant on the interdisciplinarity, but in this work I work with exercise scientists and human biology development people, and experts on concussion, and because of course you need all that to get a coherent policy. That's going to be true in every other social sphere, because we don't bring any empirical knowledge to bear on stuff. I mean, I'm aware of other areas, but yeah, if you want metaphysical tidying up, come to me or go to Kathleen Stock. But in terms of like the policy debates and the kind of social and political stuff and gendered social relations and all that, we're undergardeners, perhaps.
Beautiful segue into our lawyer.
So first of all, I'll admit that I don't know what metaphysics is, and I don't want to know what it is. Law and society often go hand in hand, but often are at tensions. So society accepted abortion, divorce, homosexuality long before the law recognized it, but sometimes the law is dragging society along with it, right? When we think about laws, if we don't work outside of the discipline of doctrinal black letter law, right, what you read in the text, then we've missed the entire point of the purpose of law. So there is no research project that I've ever undertaken that hasn't been multidisciplinary. There is no one from whom I can't learn, whether they're lawyers or not lawyers, because there's only two categories of people, right? And on this particular issue, in order for the law to best protect and uphold the human rights of all individuals involved, we need a range of disciplinary voices, but also a range of voices that come from different perspectives. So I don't believe that a research project, let alone a network like this, could work unless it worked across disciplines and across theories and across different perspectives.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rosa. Laura.
Yeah, so I think it's essential that it's multidisciplinary because, well, for a start, these, both gender criticality and gender identity are these really complex current social phenomena that are happening in the world and are changing things as we speak. And the world is multidisciplinary. It's only us that divides it up into these kind of arbitrary categories and decides that I'm just going to talk about this individual person, and you can only talk about the law, and you can only talk about the ideas. So I think it's essential that we can draw in. There are implications for every discipline, I think. So therefore, we need a space where all of those disciplines can come together.
So I'm going to abuse my position. I'm going to say one thing. This is going to sound like a sociologist, possibly a philosopher, maybe a lawyer. I have no idea from what discipline this next statement comes. But it's this, one of my domain assumptions, the thing that has shaped me as an academic for the last 2 and a bit centuries, decades. I'm not actually centuries old. I feel like it sometimes. The last 2 and a bit decades is this, you know, all academic work has to be able to speak to whatever the contemporary is. And most of us are interested in leaving the world a better place than we came into it. And a lot of our work is bound up with that. But as maybe a sociologist, I don't know, there's one thing I absolutely believe. I don't know that I could necessarily argue it through, and that's this: the conditions of change are constantly changing. And in order to understand the sheer dynamism of social life, we need as many oarsmen in the boat, and I have no idea where that metaphor came from, but we need as many people working at these problems as we possibly can. So we're just about at 30 minutes. Did I leave out anything that anyone would like to say before we shut down for the discussion?
Just thank you to you, Jo, for setting this up, for setting up the network, I'm speaking for all of us until, you know, my colleagues tell me not to, we're academics, but for inviting us in. And this is really exciting. I think this is a really big step in the right direction of dialogue and debate.
Yeah. Thank you. Now we need to give credit where it's due. John actually had he had the first idea, and he was the one who crafted some of this stuff. I'm just front woman at the moment, you know, so we need to give credit really to John here. So, you know, thank you, John. Laura, anything?
Echo that. I think it's a really exciting development, and I'm happy to come out into the light at last.
Yes, we like people who come out. And I think the only thing that I'd say is, if you've listened to this, if you have liked it, if you have disagreed fundamentally, get in touch. If you want to join and you're a member of the OU, get in touch with either John or I. If you're outside the OU and working as an academic and you'd like to get in touch with John and I. We have a whole affiliated membership program. John, do you want to say a little bit about our hopes and dreams and desires for the forthcoming academic year?
Well, we're looking to hold certainly a one-day conference and a series of workshops discussing these issues from a number of different angles. Whether we can get to meet face to face and go for the much needed pint after discussions is up in the air, of course, but we're looking to push the debate forward and provide a space, as we've all described, for expertise from a whole different range of backgrounds and disciplines to push forward thinking on this, get productive knowledge production done.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, and I'm just going to end with one thing. You'll see on the web page for the Gender Critical Network that we have a Twitter handle, a Twitter profile. I have a, you know, look, pen is what I write with. So we've got a presence on social media. So, you know, please engage with us. All right. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you all for listening, and thank you to my panel for being here. All right. Cheerio.